This video will be concerned with a consideration of inflation and unemployment. Now you'll see from the bottom right hand corner there are 115 slides. This makes it a very big video, very long video. So I really suggest that you have a break, stop the video from time to time, come back to it and go over it several times, make your own notes and fill out your notes from additional reading from other sources. But it's important that you reflect on what you're learning and what you've encountered. So do have breaks and do come back to it over a period of time. However, let's start. This is an important topic. Inflation is a topic that's in the news almost continuously, in the financial news, and unemployment, of course, is something we consider to be a problem that needs to be addressed by government economic policy and some way of getting more involvement in the labour force, some way of solving the problem of unemployment is always discussed on the media. So let's have some general comments to start. First of all, generally speaking, employment and output are interdependent. Now, that's not to say there is a linear relationship between the two. It's not suggesting that as output increases, employment increases as well. It's not a linear relationship. If output goes up by 10%, it doesn't mean that 10% more workers are involved. Workers are employed in conjunction with capital, with equipment, with machinery, with labour-saving technologies. So it's likely to be the case that as output increases, more capital will be used. But even so, we still need skilled workers to use the capital and to facilitate the whole production system. Probably in offices and in the service sector, employment tends to be more related to output. There tends to be more of a connection between output and labour. In the manufacturing sector, as I said, we have this additional component or complexity that capital is becoming more sophisticated. There's more use of robotics and more use of computer-aided design and computer-aided manufacturing. So it's not a linear relationship, and it's not meant to be. But having said that, there is a connection between the two. They are interdependent to some extent. Production does need people. It needs people to initiate the production process. It needs people to monitor it, to be involved in it, perhaps to service the machines to make sure that they're running properly, and to be involved at the end. There are many areas in industry where there is almost no connection with machinery, and it's difficult to link the effort gone in to the output. For example, in design or in technical innovation, sometimes people are working within the companies trying to innovate the product, and there doesn't appear to be any direct connection with the output level of the company. It's people experimenting, trying ideas, looking at different designs and trying to come up with new products. So it's a complex statement. As it's written on the slide at the moment, it looks very simple. Employment and output are interdependent. And there is an interdependency, but all I'm saying is it's not one-to-one. Now, output may be measured in real terms. We measure output as the number of cars produced per month or per week or whatever. We measure it as the output. A company produces so many units of output per day or per week or whatever. It could be in the service sector, the company deals with so many customers in a given day, or so many clients in a particular day. The outputs may be very heterogeneous. They may not all be the same, For example, the outputs from a solicitor's office, or what the Americans call a lawyer. The output from those offices may be very heterogeneous. Some people may seek the services of a legal expert for a small issue. Others may have highly complex cases. So output is the outcome of production, but it's difficult to measure, but it has a real component. It does come off as an output. The output of the court case, the output of the processes that the legal people have gone through to get a particular solution to a problem. It could also be the number of cars produced, as I said. So these are the real outputs. Nothing to do with money. This is the output. This is what has come out of the production process. And it's not to do with money, it's to do with the actual output. However, we use money to derive a single figure for national output. National output is very, as I said earlier, very heterogeneous. We have people producing cars, and people producing nuts and bolts, and people producing services in restaurants, and people producing transport services, and so on. So we have outputs from many different sectors. Well, we simply can't add a car to a meal in a restaurant to the services of a solicitor. They're not conformable. They're different units. They're different outputs. We can't add them up. We can't say one car plus one meal at a restaurant plus the services of a solicitor for a day plus. We'll be here forever trying to work out the output of that economy. So what we do instead is we convert it all to a common unit, and the common unit is money. So we derive a single figure for national output. So we use money to measure the national output. Now that expression on the screen may look a little sophisticated, but it's actually very, very straightforward. It just says national output is equal to the price times the output from a given company or a given organization or a given industry even. So the output from a company is, let's say, 10 cars a year. It's a very specialist car, let's say. So it produces 10 cars a year, and the cars sell for £1 million each. So P1 Q1 could be equal to 10 million. So that's that particular company dealt with. We've looked at the output of the company, Q1. We've looked at the price of the output, £1 million a car, multiplied the two together, and we get the value that's produced by that company as P1 Q1. Now P2 Q2 could be a restaurant. Q2 is the number of meals served. I know meals in restaurants are again heterogeneous. All the meals are different. Some people have one type of food and somebody else has a different type of food. But let's just gloss over that for a moment and say that the output of the restaurant is the number of meals produced. Let's just close our eyes to the fact that the meals are different. And we multiply it by P2. So we get the value of the output from the restaurant. And we can go through all of the companies in the country. P1 times Q1 plus P2 times Q2 plus P3 times Q3 plus until we get to the end. We got PI plus QI, where I is a very large number. It's all the companies in the country. So all those companies, we've measured all their outputs, we add it all together and we get the national output. And we get it valued in pounds or in the local currency, in euros or in dollars or rupees or whatever it is. The shorthand way of writing that, by the way, in statistics is just simply to say we add it all up, and the sign or the symbol for adding up is the sigma sign, the Greek sigma sign. It's like a big E, but it's sigma. It's S for sum. And what we're saying here is we're adding up J, the number of companies, from 1 up to the maximum number there are, whatever that is. And we're adding it up for all the products of P and J, price times quantity. So that second expression is the same as the first one. It's just written in statistical notation. So the P1 is the price of the PI, I should say, is the price of the ith good, and QI is its quantity. So that's the way we find national output. We add up all of the values from the different companies, the values of their outputs. Add them all together, we get national output. The value of the national output, therefore, it may increase, therefore, because of an increase in output. So national output may increase. The figure on the left-hand side, national output, which is equal to P1, Q1 plus P2, etc., that could increase. National output increase because output increases. Quite simply, if the example we had earlier, if the company producing cars, very specialist cars, instead of producing 10 every year, it produces 11. It still sells them for £1 million each. So now that company is producing £11 million worth, not 10 million as it was before, because output has increased. It's producing more cars. But it could also increase because prices increase, or both price and quantity. Go back to the cars again. The company is producing 10 cars for £1 million each. Let's say it puts the price up. The price of the cars goes up from £1 million to £1.5 million. Now it's still producing 10 cars, only now it's getting £15 million of revenue. So national output seems to have gone up as well. But it's gone up because prices have gone up. Not because the company is producing more, but because the price has gone up. In this case, let's say P1 has increased. So national output can increase because the Q, in our expression on the top, Q has increased, or if you like, P has increased, or both P and Q increases, which will also cause national income or national output to increase. Now these P's and Q's, prices and quantities, these are determined through supply and demand analysis. That's how we get the price and the quantity. These are market transactions, and the outcome of the market transaction is to give us the price for the item and the quantity to be produced. So try to envisage each P and Q as a separate supply and demand relationship. And the interaction of supply and demand in each market will determine the price in the market and the quantity. So P and Q is determined by supply and demand. Now we also need to consider something called relative and absolute prices. Let's look at a table here for a moment. Let's say we have different goods, A, B, C, D, E. And we have the absolute price, the original price. Let's say it's £2, £4, £5, £5, £6. Now, if that's the case, then the new absolute price goes up to £3, it goes up to £6, £7.50, whatever. And the relative price is then given by the figures on the right hand side. Let's do it again, make it a bit more extreme. Here we have, let's say we take A. I've changed the figure slightly here to illustrate a different situation, but take A. The original price was £2, it's gone to £3. In other words, it's gone up by 1.5. So there's in a sense a relative difference. It's not a relative price here, this is a relative difference in the two of 1.5. There's an increase of a factor of 1.5, going from 2 to 3. If it had gone from 4 to 6, it'd also be 1.5. Or from 12 to 18 for good E. 12 to 18 is still 1.5. So absolute prices has increased, but the relative price has remained the same. They're still gone up by 1.5. So they're moving relative to each other. They're staying the same. So all the prices have gone up, but they've gone up by the same proportion. So relative to each other, they are the same. And that's what we mean by relative prices. It means that all the prices, one relative to the next, remains the same. But absolute prices, well, these are determined by supply and demand. These may vary. So the changes in relative prices are determined through supply and demand. Go back to the table. It moved from, let's say for good A, it moved from £2 to £3. Well, it moved from 2 to 3 because supply and demand conditions changed, leading to a new price. So the relative prices is determined by supply and demand analysis. And this is known as partial analysis because we're just looking at individual markets. We're not looking at the overall economic system here. We're just looking at the market for particular goods. So this is known as partial analysis. Changes in absolute prices is analysed by macroeconomics. What caused the prices to rise? That's macroeconomics. Now we need to be careful here about these definitions. They're important. Changes in relative prices, the change in the price of one good compared to another, is brought about by changes in the market, changes in supply and demand. This is known as partial analysis. It's to deal with microeconomic situations, something that causes a change in one market that doesn't cause the change in another market, or causes an even bigger change in a different market. So relative prices are moving because of supply and demand situations. This is partial analysis. But what causes the prices to, let's say, increase? These are down to macroeconomic circumstances. Now, changes in the general price level are measured by means of index numbers. That's how the Office for National Statistics in the UK calculates the rate of inflation. What it actually does is it asks a large number of people to keep diaries of what they spent over a certain period of time, and it asks them to record the prices of the goods and how much they spent and so on. So it's able to work out what goods and services are important to us because it's conducted a large sample of the population, and it also looks at the prices that was encountered by the people when they were shopping. And it can do this for year upon year. But it also has a base year. It has 1 year where it fixes at 100. It makes all the prices equal to 100. And then the following year it works out the prices. The prices have gone up. It might have gone up to 105. In which case inflation, let's say, was 5%. So we use index numbers to work out the general price level and changes in the price level. For example, the retail price index or the consumer price index. It depends on which country we live in and how the individual governments in different countries measure inflation. Some have different measures and some include different items and some exclude different items. But it may be called the retail price index or the consumer price index, or various indices will have various names depending on what the government deemed to be appropriate. Generally, the retail price index or the consumer price index is calculated as a means of a random sample of goods and services and the assessment of their importance. As I said, generally speaking, the Office for National Statistics in the UK, who is responsible for calculating the changes in prices, they will ask a large number of people to participate, keep a diary for a certain period of time, recording their expenditure, what items they purchased, how much they paid, and so on. And from this it can work out the importance of certain goods. It can work out the prices and what was spent, and out of this a whole basket of goods is identified as important, and then the Office for National Statistics monitor that basket of goods by taking samples in different shops and by figuring out the prices over sometimes over a monthly period or over a 6 monthly period. Depends on the government. In different countries it might be different time levels and so on, but it knows the basket of goods to watch because the sample survey asking people to keep diaries of their expenditure, they know what items are being purchased and are popular, so they monitor that basket of goods to try and work out inflation. Now, the criticisms of the inflation index. We know we use an inflation index because we talk all the time about the rate of inflation being so many percent, 2%. Well, that means it's gone up from, let's say, 100 to 102. Or it's gone up by a certain proportion every year, which gives us the inflation index. Well, there are criticisms of this. For a start, it doesn't take all the goods and services into account. It's subject to a margin of error. We talk about the rate of inflation as calculated in different countries as if that is fact. In fact, it's an estimate. It's the best estimate that the government can make or can work out, but it's not absolutely accurate. It is an estimate because it can't take all the goods and services into account. There are millions and millions and millions of goods and services, and it would be an enormous task for the government to try to monitor all the goods and services in the economy. So it really is based on a sample, and therefore there will be a margin of error associated with the calculation of inflation, or looking at the index associated with inflation. It doesn't allow also for regional differences. We know, for example, in the UK, the UK is quite a small economy, but we know that, for example, in London, prices rise more than other parts of the country. Some parts of the country are based on farming, and it's a nice, easygoing life. The farmers work hard and so on, but it's a nice life. It's not too intense. There's not a lot of people travelling around on tubes and transport and running around from office to office and so on. So it's not as manic, or it doesn't appear to be as manic as London. So rates of inflation in other parts of the country can be much lower. Prices of houses, for example, in London rise very sharply, but the price of houses in some farming area may not rise as fast. So somebody with a certain sum of money to spend, let's say in London, on a house, they may buy a very small house because houses are so expensive. That sum of money might buy a very small house in London. The same sum of money, if spent in some other part of the country, less populated part of the country, might buy a very large house. So there are regional differences. It doesn't allow for changes in the quality of goods as well. We look at the price of goods and say, let's say the price of goods are increasing. Let's say the cost of a television has gone up by, it was selling originally, let's say, for £100. Now it costs £500. Just say. But it's not the same item. televisions today are much more sophisticated. They have better pictures, they have better sound quality, they have additional functions. They're almost different products. We call them a television, like we call the same item back in 20, 30 years ago a television, but they are totally different. Originally televisions were in black and white, and the picture quality was very poor. But now the picture quality is extremely good, the sound quality is very good, and some televisions are smart televisions. They're able to have a whole range of channels and are able to access the internet and so on. So the quality of the goods change over time. So using an index over a long period of time doesn't seem appropriate. Now, additional criticisms of the inflation index. Well, if the index is inaccurate, then pay claims will be based on erroneous information. So it's very important that the government gets the inflation index worked out correctly. Trade unions may use the rate of inflation as the basis for pay negotiations. If inflation is, let's say, 5% in the country, the trade unions will want 5% for their members at least, because their members need to keep up with the rate of inflation. But if the index was wrong in the first place, it wasn't 5%, it was a miscalculation, or it was inaccurate because the data was collected badly or wrongly, or the margin of error on the basket of goods that were monitored was not taken into account, or there was some error involved, then the pay negotiations will be based on false information, on bad information. It's not information, it's disinformation. Also, the use of an index moves pay negotiations away from local conditions. If a company is struggling to survive, let's say it's encountering problems in the market selling its product, or it faces globalization and cheap imports, or their competitors are becoming very innovative, or whatever. So a company is in trouble. Now, if the trade unions arrive and say they want to cover the rate of inflation, and the rate of inflation is, let's pretend, 5%, the company hasn't got 5%. It's struggling to continue in business. So the pay negotiations are not related to the local conditions, the conditions of the company. Now, if the union in this case is successful and gets, let's say, the 5%, then the company may go bankrupt, which means unemployment will have increased. Productivity and market conditions should be considered more important than an abstract national index. It's important that companies be recognized for the conditions that they're in, the market they're in. How competitive is the market? How exposed are they to cheap imports as competitors? How productive is the company? Can it afford to invest in labour-saving equipment or high technological equipment which will increase productivity, increase output per machine or output per worker? And if pay negotiations take these into account, that's more realistic. But if the pay negotiations are based on national statistics, perhaps based on the inflation rate as published by the government, then the company may not be able to afford to pay that. And as I said, the company may go out of business. So this raises another question. Why fight inflation? Why is inflation such a bad thing? Why do governments attempt to control inflation? Well, first of all, it leads to inefficiency. less inefficient producers will be able to stay in business because of the steady rise in market prices. That may be a strange thing to say, but in the competitive situation, in the competitive market, less efficient producers go out of business. It's survival of the fittest. The best companies, the more efficient companies, survive. The less efficient go out of business. This means that if there is inflation, there's a veil behind which the inefficient producers can hide. Prices in the market in general are rising, so the price of their items are rising. They're generating more revenue as a consequence, so they may be able to continue in business. So what inflation is doing is it's propping up inefficient companies. Of course, when inflation comes down in the future, those inefficient companies will be exposed as being inefficient, and they will lose and perhaps go out of business. But it does hide inefficiency. Also, asset valuation and accurate bookkeeping is difficult in times of inflation. Imagine trying to value the company when the prices of the assets, the prices of the machines and the buildings, and when everything's changing. They've measured it in 1 year, and now inflation between the 2 years means prices have gone up, so they've got to try and reevaluate the assets, the buildings, the machines. It's a real problem. So asset valuation becomes very difficult, and valuing stock items in the stores could be very tricky as well. They were purchased in one time period when inflation was low, perhaps. Now inflation's high, so how should the stocks be priced now? Does the company use last in, first out, or first in, first out, or an average price, or how does the company value the stock? So there are issues about asset valuation. It becomes very problematic in times of inflation. And there is a cost associated with changing price labels. Imagine a company that sells hundreds, maybe thousands of items, perhaps a high street store, a large high street shop or store. It stocks thousands of items. Because of inflation, it's got to go around and reprice all of those items, perhaps on a regular basis. That's an extremely costly activity. All the records have to be updated, all the tills have to be reprogrammed and changed, and it's an expensive process. So again, inflation is costly. And it reduces market information. Consumers find it difficult to interpret market signals. As consumers, we roughly know what we buy. We're creatures of habit. We tend to buy roughly the same items over and over. These are our staple items, types of food that we like, or types of clothing or products that we purchase almost on a routine basis. And we know which shops to go to, which ones give us the best prices. We've learned from experience, from searching. We've searched out the best. But inflation destroys all of that information. Inflation can distort the figures. So companies which were the most efficient and the best places to buy become, or start to look like they're more expensive because inflation has increased the price. And we have to now resume searching and going back over the other shops to see which one is handling the situation best and where is it best to purchase. So our process of search has to be renewed, and that's costly. So it leads to inefficiencies. So one reason why we want to fight inflation is because it leads to inefficiency, for these 4 reasons perhaps. Inflation also distributes incomes perversely. It distributes income away from the poor and towards the rich, which sounds the wrong way around. it takes from the poor and gives to the rich. The poor tend to depend on nominal income, on wages and transfer payments, for example, pensions and welfare payments. And these are nominal. They're really issued in money terms. The pension is so much per week. Wages are so much per week. Or nominal income. The amount of income people get is fixed in money terms. So the poor tend to get their payments in money terms. The rich tend to own assets denominated in real terms. So rich people have property, have ordinary shares. Ordinary shares are just ownership of real assets, a share in the ownership of real assets, a share in the ownership of the land and the buildings and the machinery in companies, let's say. They might have antiques or oil paintings, or they may have gold. They may have all sorts of assets which are denominated in real terms. But these tend to maintain their value in times of inflation because they're scarce. So as inflation cuts in, people on fixed incomes can buy less. So the poor can buy less. But the rich, in a sense, get richer because their assets is denominated in real terms. So their houses go up in value, their land goes up in value, their ordinary shares will tend to keep pace with inflation, their oil paintings will go up in value. Well, obviously it depends on the oil painting, maybe a bad example, but the ordinary shares and the property and so on will go up in value. So the rich seem to be almost immune to the problems of inflation, whereas the poor suffer. So that's seen to be another reason to fight inflation. Inflation may lead to monetary collapse. Now, some people may think that this is a very extreme argument to make, but it has happened. It's not theory. It happened in Germany in the interwar period. There are examples of countries, even in the late 20th century and into the 21st century, of countries living with very high rates of inflation. Zimbabwe, for example, in Africa, has got rates of inflation into the thousands and thousands of percent. So much so that their currency, they were dealing with currency denominations of billions, and the billions would only buy perhaps a meal or some basic items. So inflation can lead to monetary collapse. Money facilitates exchange. It enables the division of labour in society. So we need money. Money is what holds the society together to a large extent. We need it because it enables the division of labour. Some people are able to work as teachers. Others can work as car mechanics, and some people can work as carpenters or as plumbers, or some people can work as cooks, whatever. They all can do this because they receive an income, and they're able to convert the income into the goods and services that they can't provide for themselves. So the cook gets paid an income, and with the income the cook can then employ a plumber to fix the drains. The plumber fixes the drains, but then can use that money to employ an electrician to fix his or her lights. The electrician can use part of the money to buy a television, because the electrician can't make a television, so we have to buy it. So money is what facilitates all of these exchanges, passing money one to the other. Inflation erodes confidence in money. As we see inflation kicking in and money is losing value, we start to lose confidence in money. And this becomes very dangerous because it's money that is holding the whole system together. But once we start losing confidence in it, then we will start to reject money and look for something else. In times of hyperinflation, society may revert to barter, and the advantages of the division of labour is lost. Now, barter means we swap one good for another. So if I want, let's say I want something from you, I want your television. So I want a television, let's say, and I've got a laptop computer and I want to exchange it, an old laptop computer. Now I would try to barter this. What I need here is I need someone who has a television, that's what I want, but it's someone who is also looking for an old laptop in exchange. Now this is a problem of what's known as double coincidence. I need to find someone who has a television, but I need to find someone not only who has a television, but someone who has a television and wants an old laptop. That's double coincidence. Now the chances of finding such a person is very, very difficult, and the search cost involved in trying to find such a person would be very large. And even if I did find someone, let's say I advertised in the paper and I found someone said, we've got a television and we want to swap it for an old laptop, and I think that's ideal, that's what I want, and we make contact. The problem is now, this television that is being swapped, is it a big television or a little television? And the laptop that I've got, is it very old? Does it run certain programs? How long does it take to start up? Does it look good? Has it been scratched? So even when I do find a person who wants what I'm offering, when we solve the problem of double coincidence, we still have a problem about the quality of the products or the nature of the products. So we need money, and hyperinflation, very high rates of inflation, eats into the efficiency of money to do this task, to facilitate exchange. Germany in the interwar period suffered from very high rates of inflation, so much so that the Reichsmark was broadly destroyed. People would negotiate pay settlements by the hour and get large sums of cash, very, very large sums of cash, big wads of cash. But then they would try to convert that into real goods and services as quickly as possible before it lost its value, because it was losing its value by the minute. So it was imperative to try and convert out of money and into real goods and services. So the whole economy really collapsed. So inflation may lead to monetary collapse, and that would be a disaster, because that means we have to start to look after ourselves. But we're not self-sufficient. We can't all weave cloth and make clothing and at the same time grow crops and feed ourselves, whilst at the same time maintaining the car and maintaining our standard of living. So we need money as a facilitator of exchange. What we have is specialization in society, the division of labor. Some people become teachers, some people become doctors, some people become accountants, some people become plumbers. And they work at that, they specialize it on those tasks. They're good at those tasks. And they get paid, and then to convert their money into the things that they themselves can't make, or would find it difficult to make. Inflation increases the price of exports. Well, this is another problem. This will affect the balance of payments. The exchange rate will be affected if there's inflation. Exports become expensive, so people in other countries will not want to buy the exports. They're too expensive. So exports will fall off and the exchange rate will be affected. Employment in export industries will be affected. So there may be unemployment in companies that export because the price of the exports have gone up, have increased. So inflation can affect export prices. It can affect the exchange rate as a consequence because there's less exports. There may be even more imports as a consequence because imports will look cheaper. This will cause the exchange rate to fall. Now that will be dealt with in other videos in the course, so I'm not going to go into it here, but for the moment just consider it as inflation has caused a fall in exports, and that is not good for the country. It can lead to unemployment amongst large sections of the population that are involved in exporting industries, and it can cause an increase in the price of imports because the exchange rate falls, which may lead to an increase in the price of raw materials which is used in industry. So it has a very upsetting effect on the economy. Now, it's also the case that inflation is like a tax on expenditure. Let's take a supply and demand situation. Assume that this is the market for a single good. So this is what we call partial analysis. It's just looking at one single good, and here we have supply and demand. We have the equilibrium price at P1 and the equilibrium quantity at Q1. Now, if the government increases aggregate demand, AD, then the demand curve for this particular product will shift outwards. It'll move out to D1, D1. Prices will rise, and this difference in price may be seen as a tax. You see, the government has increased the demand, aggregate demand, and that's what caused the demand curve to shift outwards. The government may have made more money available in the economy, so people have more to spend, and as a consequence they try to buy more of the good, putting the price up. But as the price rises, people have to pay more. It moves from P1 to P2, and that's really the same as an increase in taxes on the good. So inflation is like a tax on goods. Now let's examine some of the contradictions or conflicts that inflation can lead to. First of all, we have a list of government objectives. These are traditionally held to be the government objectives of economic policy: high rates of economic growth, balance of payments equilibrium, full employment and low inflation. These were originally set out by a government committee in 1959, I think it was, the Radcliffe Committee. They're based broadly on Keynesian economics. It was believed under the Keynesian system that governments could, by using various government instruments like fiscal policy, monetary policy, exchange rate policy, regional policy, industrial policy, all sorts of particular types of policy, by using a combination of these, it could fine-tune the economy to bring about high rates of economic growth, which means more prosperity in the long run, balance of payments equilibrium, full employment. We'd have to define full employment, of course. It doesn't literally mean full employment. It may mean very low rates or very low levels of unemployment, and low inflation. So these would be the objectives that were traditionally followed. They, in a sense, are not spoken of very much anymore in the press. The balance of payments equilibrium, well, we now have a floating exchange rate. The exchange rates are not fixed against each other. So the like supply and demand, it's self-adjusting. It rectifies itself. Some days the exchange rate is very high, and some days it's very low, and it floats up and downwards. And we live with that floating up and downwards. High rates of economic growth, well, there's published usually the end of the year, and the government's economic record is associated with its ability to get economic growth into the country. Full employment, the government is constantly trying to reduce unemployment, but if it rises or falls, it seems to be almost accepted by the press and by the electorate in many countries that this is a consequence of world markets, of perhaps the particular government's economic policy. But there's a greater understanding that markets tend to be globalized, and sometimes governments can't do a lot about employment. And low inflation, the governments are more held responsible for the rates of inflation. But these are really more historic objectives. They don't seem to be pushed as vehemently nowadays as in the past. But nonetheless, what we want to do here is explore the relationship, particularly the relationship between full employment and low inflation, those two. So, two of the objectives of government economic policy are full employment and low inflation. So we're talking here about 3 and 4 in that list. And we're going to explore this relationship between the attainment of full employment whilst at the same time lowering inflation. Now, the achievement of the dual objectives of full employment and zero inflation may be plotted on a diagram. And if it was plotted, if we had no inflation and no unemployment, or if you like, full employment, full employment and no unemployment are the same thing. So if we plot this on a diagram, what we get is a point at the origin, at 0. We have no inflation, zero inflation, and zero unemployment. So we'd have a point at the origin. The actual rate of inflation and average level of unemployment in a given year may be shown on the diagram. So it could be for a given year that inflation was inflation 1 and unemployment was U1. So we'd have an X in this diagram. The X indicates the amount of inflation and the amount of unemployment in average terms over the course of the year. And that's where this particular economy would sit. That could apply to a particular year. For example, I don't know, 1952 or 1961 or whatever. A particular year, that could be the position in a country in that year. And for a different year, it could be a different position. In 53, it could be there's more unemployment and more inflation. So the X will have moved. Now this leads us to what's known as the Phillips relationship. A.W. Phillips in 1958 showed a statistical relationship between wage inflation and unemployment in the UK from 1861 to 1957. So what Phillips did was very interesting for economic policy, as it turned out. But just in terms of statistics, it looks like a very interesting calculation. He simply took our diagram, the one we just had, and he plotted a scatter diagram and then fitted a curve of best fit. He was showing off in a sense. Normally we fit a straight line, a regression line, but he fitted a curve of best fit. So the scatter diagram could look something like that. Now each one of these X's represents a particular year. So we'd have the 1952 one is in there somewhere, 1953, but we'd also have 1900 and so on. He excluded the war years, 1914, 1918, 1939, 1945, because they would distort the figures. They in a sense become outliers. So he left those out. But for the rest, he plotted this series, and he got some sort of scatter of points. And then, as I said, he fitted a curve of best fit. and that became known as the Phillips curve. So if I take away the scatter just to tidy it up, that became known as the Phillips curve. As unemployment falls, inflation increases. You can see as we move across from, let me put the cursor onto the screen for a second. As we move across from here across to here, inflation starts to rise. So we have this trade-off relationship. Now there are two possible explanations for this curve. One is known as demand pull inflation. Now, demand pull inflation, as the economy approaches full employment, expenditure increases and prices are pulled up. So as the economy moves towards full employment, more people have jobs, more people have incomes, more people are spending. So the price of goods is very buoyant. It starts to rise. There's greater demand in the economy, so prices are pulled up. So as we move towards full employment, prices are increased. And the second, as the economy approaches full employment, expenditure increases and prices are pulled up. That's the demand pull inflation. Let's look ahead in terms of a diagram. We're moving towards full employment, so demand for goods is increasing, more people have money to spend, so expenditure increases, the demand curve for individual products shifts outwards to D1, and you can see prices rise as a consequence. Now that could be an explanation for demand pull inflation. Clearly there has to be another level here at operation. The government has to, in a sense, validate the reduction in unemployment. The government will have to put money into the economy, and that money would have to be used to buy the goods and services which will cause the increase in demand. But prices will be pulled up. The second one is cost push, and this is much more controversial in today's world. There was a belief that as the economy approached full employment, costs increase. Now this may in part be due to production bottlenecks, because the economy now is running at very high rates of economic activity. So companies are running at full capacity, and because they're running at full capacity there are bottlenecks in production and shortages of raw materials, and waiting times for deliveries are increased, and costs are rising because labour is in short supply, more skilled workers are required, and so costs tend to rise. Costs rise, prices go up. So lead times on deliveries, for example, may increase, as I just said. Now, as the economy approaches full employment, costs increase. So it's due to, let's say, bottlenecks, increased lead times on deliveries, and use of less efficient factors of production. Now this may sound bad, but sometimes less skilled workers are employed to do skilled jobs because there's such a shortage. But the less skilled workers are less able to perform the functions correctly, so costs will rise. There'll be a lot of rejects within the company, a lot of production lost, or jobs which are not suitable to, in terms of quality, to meet customer expectations. Now the implications of the Phillips curve. Well, let's take a point A on the curve. So here we've got inflation 1 and unemployment 1. Inflation could be, say, 3%, let's say. Unemployment at a certain level, so many people out of work. So we're on the point A. Now the curve suggests a trade-off. If we go to point B, we're going to have less unemployment. Unemployment falls from U1 to U2. But inflation increases from, say, 3% up to 9% or whatever. It increases from inflation 1 up to inflation 2. So the implication is that there is a trade-off. That's what is seen. Now there are two ways of looking at all of this. There's the monetarist perspective to try and fix inflation, and there is the Keynesian solution. The Keynesian solution was popular from about 1945 into about, difficult to say exactly, but the mid-70s, mid-1970s. But it's important to have a look at the two, just to have a contrast. So let's look at the Keynesian solution. According to this view, inflation is most likely to occur at or near full employment. So the Keynesians wanted full employment. That was the basis of the Keynesian approach. That's what Keynesianism was about, to bring about full employment and recovery from the Second World War. The solution is to regulate the level of demand so as to curb inflationary pressure. So moving down towards full employment, but as inflation kicks off, try to regulate inflation by adopting various measures. Now governments have tried all sorts of measures to try and control inflation. In the past, governments in the UK had a prices and incomes policy. They tried to forbid companies from increasing their prices. Of course, that completely cancels out market economics. But they also tried to stop workers from negotiating their pay rises. And of course that was resisted by the trade unions. There was a lot of strife, a lot of problems, and eventually that policy broke down. So as we move towards full employment, prices may start to rise. The government needs to deal with the price issue. If we look at the ADS model, the aggregate supply and demand model, we really have a position like this, where the aggregate supply has gone vertical. That's at full employment. YF. YF is full employment. It's the full employment level of real national income. That's the maximum that can be produced in the economy. They can't produce to the right of YF because there are no resources available. All the resources are used and used in the production process. So aggregate supply is vertical at that point. And aggregate demand is represented by AD. Now, if aggregate demand is increased, then the price will rise from P0 to P1. In other words, that's what's known as an inflationary gap. That's the problem. That's what's causing inflation. Aggregate demand is too much. There's too much demand in the economy, not enough supply, so prices are being pulled up. So what's needed is to bring back aggregate demand down to AD. Move it from AD1 backwards to AD to solve the inflationary gap. Now that's one way of looking at this. Let's approach it again and say, let's talk about aggregate demand. Now aggregate demand in the economy, the total amount of demand into the economy, is based on what consumers spend, consumer expenditure, what companies spend on new capital goods and equipment and additions to stocks. That's called investment expenditure. It has to be on new capital goods. If it's on existing capital goods, if a company buys another company, that was accounted for in the past. So that would lead to double counting. So that's not allowed. So therefore we have consumer expenditure plus investment in new capital goods or additions to stocks. Government expenditure, what the government spends, and of course what the government spends on new items of expenditure. And also what other countries spend on the exports of this country. It's what other countries spend on the exports from this country. So we have all of these various components of aggregate demand. consumer expenditure, investment expenditure, government expenditure, and export revenue. Now, of these, the government has most control over its own expenditure. The government finds it difficult to control exports or investment or consumer expenditure. So it really has most control over its own expenditure. At least it should have. And this leads to the importance of what we call fiscal policy. Fiscal policy deals with government expenditure and taxation. So the government uses fiscal policy as a means of controlling aggregate demand. Now, to solve the inflationary gap, the government may increase taxation or reduce its own expenditure, because the government has some say over fiscal policy. So it could increase taxation. That means taking income away from the consumers. The consumers who work pay more in tax, they have less disposable income, therefore they're less able to buy goods, there's less demand for the goods, and the prices will come down. So the government may be able to control inflation by increasing taxes, or indeed by decreasing its own expenditure. So the government may use fiscal policy to try and control the rate of inflation in the economy. However, the Phillips curve really broke down, and this posed a real problem for governments, and I suppose also for economists to interpret what was happening as well. The problem here rests with something called money illusion. Keynesian's analysis, or the whole edifice of Keynesianism, was really predicated on this idea of workers negotiating pay settlements in nominal terms. Workers worked for money. They didn't work for the goods and services that the money bought, they worked for money. So workers worked for pounds and pence, for dollars and dimes. They worked for money. So workers had a money illusion. They wanted more money at the end of the week or the end of the month. That's what they wanted. They wanted more money. As to what the money could buy, they didn't bridge that gap. They just wanted more money. They were fixated on money. Money was important. And that was known as money illusion. And Keynes assumed that the working population suffered from money illusion. They didn't make the link between what they earned and what they could buy. They just looked for money illusion. For example, workers may negotiate an extra £5 per week without making reference to the rate of inflation. So they want £5, an extra £5 a week, but inflation could be running at a percentage which would mean that it will really need a lot more just to keep abreast of inflation. It could be the case. But the workers didn't take into account rates of inflation. There was a big prejudice about looking at rates of inflation, in fact, amongst much of the organised labour in the 1960s in particular. They felt that if they bargained in percentages, then somebody on a big salary would get a big increase, whereas somebody on a small salary would get a small increase, and that they felt was very unfair. So they didn't like negotiating in percentage terms. They negotiated for paper, pieces of paper, for money. They negotiated for money, and they suffered from what's known as money illusion. That was the belief. But somewhere in, difficult again to say when exactly, somewhere in the 70s perhaps, in the early part of the 1970s in the UK, trade unions changed and they started to negotiate in percentage terms. So there was a shift from negotiating in money terms to negotiating real pay negotiations. They started to compare what they were getting against the rate of inflation. So if inflation was 5%, they wanted 5%. In fact, they wanted more than 5%. They would have 5% to cover the rate of inflation, and they would want a real pay increase, because people like to think they're better off next year compared to now. So they would want 5% to cover inflation plus, let's say, another 5%. So they would negotiate for 10%. And management would disagree, the companies would disagree, there'd be negotiations, and there would be perhaps strikes or industrial conflict, and eventually some agreed solution would come about. But they were negotiating in real terms. Why they started to negotiate in real terms in the 70s, it's difficult to say. Some people think it was the expansion of higher education, and many students from working class backgrounds were now going to university and understood economics and went back and influenced the trade unions to start negotiating in this manner. Whether that's true or false, it's difficult to say. It's just something that I read somewhere. So they negotiated percentage increases in pay. That's the point. They started to negotiate in percentages. They weren't negotiating for paper anymore or for money. They were negotiating for percentages. Percentage pay increases. And they were comparing their percentage pay increase with the rate of inflation. Now if we look at the Phillips curve here, let's say the government reduces unemployment from a very high rate where there's no inflation down to, say U1. So the government tries to hold unemployment at U1. That's politically acceptable for the government. They want to control unemployment at U1. Well, that means inflation is 2%. Now the trade unions will negotiate for 2% to hold their incomes, the incomes of their membership, to hold their incomes in real terms, so they're not worse off because of inflation. But the chances are they're going to try and negotiate more. They want to go back to their membership saying you are going to be better off next year compared to this year. They don't want to go back and say you're going to be as well off next year as this year. They'd like to say you're going to be better off because we've negotiated a better result for you. So the trade unions may take 2% as the baseline and then add an extra whatever, an extra 8%. So now they negotiate for 8%, or they might negotiate for an extra 2%, negotiate for 4%, but certainly will negotiate above the 2%. Let's say they negotiate for 4%. Now if the government maintain unemployment at U1 and use its monetary and fiscal powers to try and keep unemployment at U1, then in the following time period prices will rise by 4%. That's what the unions negotiated, and unemployment is at U1. So now inflation has increased to 4%. In the following year it may go up to 8%. In other words, the trade unions, when it was at 4%, they negotiate for 4% to maintain their standards of living, but they also negotiate for an extra 4%. They would probably negotiate for a lot more. They might negotiate for an extra 10% and then negotiate. But having negotiated and having entered into negotiations, perhaps collective bargaining arrangements and so on, and perhaps even involved agencies to arbitrate, and they might settle for 8%. Well, you can see here that we've gone off the Phillips curve. We're now moving upwards. We're moving up in a vertical line almost. So inflation is accelerating. And the government has done nothing except keep unemployment at U1, keep unemployment down from where the Phillips curve cuts the horizontal, the unemployed axis. So as long as the government tries to reduce unemployment, inflation can accelerate. In other words, the Phillips curve is not a trade-off. The Phillips curve is a vertical line. It's a position, it's a level of unemployment. Sometimes this is referred to as the natural rate of unemployment. Now, we deal with the natural rate of unemployment in other classes as well, but as long as the government keeps unemployment at this rate, inflation will be under control. If the government tries to reduce unemployment, then inflation will rise, and it'll keep on rising. It'll accelerate. It'll go 2, 4, 8, perhaps 16, 32, whatever. It'll just accelerate. So the Phillips curve is not a trade-off as was originally calculated by A.W. Phillips. Because of the change in the way trade unions negotiate, they've moved from nominal to real. They no longer suffer from money illusion. Because of that, then inflation is the problem. And if the government tries to reduce unemployment, inflation will accelerate. So the natural rate of unemployment is the rate at which is compatible with zero inflation. So we have zero inflation, and that is a measure of the natural rate of unemployment. Now, the upshot of all of this is that the government can't do anything about unemployment. If it does, it'll lead to accelerating inflation. Now, this whole emphasis in this class has been broadly based on Keynesian economics. There are other classes on the course which should be looked at. For example, the classes on the Fisher equation of exchange, which give a different perspective on how to control inflation by controlling the money supply. But there seems to be an acceptance amongst governments over the last probably 10 years, maybe longer, that it's important to control inflation, and the labour market is adjusted by what's known as supply-side policies. Supply-side policies means the government tries to train the population in modern working techniques. They try to bring about more employment because more business startups, more support for industry, lower corporate taxes, trying to make entrepreneurs feel that it's better to do business in the country and not to set up businesses overseas. And so it's based on trying to get more employment in and controlling inflation through controlling the money supply. Now, that is the emphasis dealt with in our topics on the Fisher equation of exchange, and there are classes on that on the course which you should look at. But in this particular one, what I wanted to do was to show the breakdown of the Phillips curve, but also the breakdown of Keynesian economics, because this led ultimately to the collapse of Keynesian economics and the, if you like, the reintroduction of monetarism and that type of more classical thinking. But that's all I'm going to deal with in this class. It's been a very long one, as I said. I hope you've stopped it many times, come back to it, and I hope you have come back to it, and made some notes, and continue to make some notes and think about it. But it should be seen in conjunction with the other classes, particularly the ones on the Fisher equation, as I mentioned earlier. But that's all I'm going to deal with here, so let's leave it at that and say thank you for watching.